Good afternoon, folks. So this is track A, session from breakout session 8 from 3 to 4:30 p.m. So we have 3 speakers today. And our first speaker is Ben Wilkinson. So on your program, it probably says Mark Lenters, but Mark had an emergency come up, and so Ben's going to stand in for him. Ben is with Ourston MSA Professional Services, and Ben is a traffic and roundabout designer with over 20 years of experience. For the past 10 years, Ben has been focused on roundabout design and alternative intersections. So with that, maybe Ben, you can say a few more words about yourself and get started.
All right, thank you. So I'm filling in for Mark Lenters, those of you that were looking for him. I'm not him, and I'm going to be presenting some of his slides and information here today, so bear with me a little bit. All right, so introduction. I worked with Mark, Ourston Roundabout Engineering for some time. For those of you that know us, we've done a lot of roundabout design, peer reviews, those kind of things across the country. Hundreds of roundabouts. Kevin Kulo, who's coming up next, worked with us as well. One of our basis in roundabout design is, for us, it's always been science-minded, evidence-based. We like to do things that we have evidence to support. While we do have a lot of opinions on things with roundabouts as well, we do try to back those things up. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is the lack of good access guidance for roundabouts, and maybe possibly an approach for the future with access management and roundabouts. So first of all, I will talk about the current guidance on access near roundabouts. The corner clearance reductions, dilemma zone eliminated. The gaps in the guidance. As I said, there's not a lot of good guidance on access and roundabouts out there. Access management with roundabouts goes deeper than just U-turns. I think we all know about the U-turns with roundabouts and how good that is. I'm going to talk about NCHRP 772, which was evaluating the performance of corridors with roundabouts. It wasn't necessarily an access document, but we're gonna deep dive into that a little bit to talk about it and how it affects access. Roundabouts in a system or corridor versus standalone, ideal way to harmonize transportation and land use. This being an access conference, I think a lot of you already know some of those points. And then arterial speed management is correlated with access flexibility. Mid-block driveways between roundabouts are not impacted as first thought, so I'll talk a little bit more about that too. The video in the background is of a roundabout here in Wisconsin. That's a 3-lane roundabout with a lot of businesses right on the corner with access points very close to it. I'll show you some slides of that a little further down. And lastly, wide nodes, narrow roads. That's long been one of our things with roundabouts that we've talked about. Fewer lanes for the same throughput, and that goes along with access as well. All right, so we'll get this out of the way right away. I think we all know about the U-turn benefit with access points. If you have roundabouts versus traffic signals, you can install medians down the sides, make U-turns to do right in, right outs. That one's pretty clear, and I think everybody here probably gets that. Direct access to roundabouts. With roundabouts, the picture on the left, for instance, is at a Walmart site. That roundabout was basically installed for the Walmart. You run into a lot of situations along the way where you have a new development that doesn't meet traffic signal warrants, but the developer really wants some kind of control. Well, roundabouts are a good way to do that. You don't necessarily have to meet a traffic signal warrant to install this if the developer is willing to pay for it. We've got lots of examples across the country of big box stores going in and roundabouts being the preferred way because they didn't need to meet any kind of warrant to put that in necessarily. And then driveway access on the picture on the right, low volume driveways, those kind of things. That's traditionally been done with roundabouts too. Really no real concerns with that. It's generally safer than a T intersection with a driveway into it. The driver has to make similar judgment in leaving their driveway. However, the speeds are usually controlled. They only go one way out of their driveway. Current guidance on access with roundabouts is pretty limited. In NCHRP 672, which is the second edition of the Roundabout Guide, there are three main considerations for driveway locations relative to a roundabout entry or exit. The volume of the driveway is a consideration. The queue of the entry at the roundabout, and then the available space. And as in the diagram, that's the diagram from the report. You know, very typical to what you would do at any other intersection. You got to look at these factors when determining where an access point may go. Sight distance between users is another one that's also important. The big thing with this is that unlike other types of intersection guidance, if you look around at some of the design guides, different states, different things, there's functional areas associated with intersections. Roundabouts really don't have that shown right now, so all of these things become the designer has the ability themselves to make a decision based on some of these factors, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it leaves for a lot of opportunities for people to make varying decisions, and agencies have a really hard time using that approach because different designers do different things. Lastly, the dilemma zone with roundabouts, and if you're not overly familiar with that term, the dilemma zone that we refer to is at a traditional traffic signal, when that light turns yellow, there's a dilemma that's caused by the driver of, do I speed up and go through the intersection, or do I slow down and stop? And that's basically eliminated with a roundabout because they have all the drivers that come up to it have the same control. So, and they know that they've got to yield at the entry. There's still a little bit of a dilemma zone, but we would say it's mostly gone in this scenario. All right, so this is just some traditional guidance that people look at. You know, corner clearance, driveway location, those kind of things. You can find this in the Access Management Manual. There's no real research on roundabout corner clearance at this time. Functional intersection area. Again, this has a lot to do with as you approach or depart from an intersection. You know, how much room do you need? And I'll touch on this a little bit further on the next slide. As you approach an intersection, so on the left, there's a diagram that shows you have the queue storage, the deceleration distance, and then the perception reaction time that are all impacted as you approach an intersection depending on the speeds. On the right-hand side, and this is kind of hard to see, but this is from the latest Access Management Manual. The different speeds involved make a big difference on how long those distances are. And we kind of look at the top three, the 20 through 30 mile per hour ranges, being what all roundabouts should fall in that range, because the design speed for entering roundabouts should be 30 miles an hour or less. And in some cases they're 25 or 20, whereas almost all traffic signal situations are between 35 and 55. There are very few intersections that have traffic signals that are designed for a speed less than 35 miles an hour. So you can see right off the bat that there's a difference in those distances as you approach a roundabout for functional area, which leads to the conclusion we've always all had. We can probably have access points a little closer to the roundabout than we can for a signal. The other important part there is that the queue storage is generally shorter. If you compare traffic operations at a signal versus a roundabout, due to the red light and people queuing up at signals, in almost all cases you get shorter queue distances, 95th percentile queue distances, that kind of thing, than you do at a traffic signal. So, which leads me a little bit to NCHRP 772. This was a study that was done about the speed of traveling through roundabout corridors. And what I'm gonna do is just point a little bit to some of the research that was done there. But this really had a lot of graphs on how the travel speed is, so from free flow speed and how vehicles need to slow down as they approach and go through a roundabout. And there's the roundabout influence area, which is referenced, and it's shown as the area where you need to start slowing down until you get back to the free flow speed. So that's kind of the idea with the roundabout influence area. We're making a statement that in some ways that is very similar to the functional area that we traditionally look at. And can there be some guidance created based on this study or further study that would help us define functional areas of roundabouts? And below is just again the figure that comes from the functional area of if you have two intersections near each other, you can see the functional areas. On the top would be kind of a roundabout. In some ways they're somewhat similar in that example, but that's just because we've just got two figures on top of each other. It has nothing to do with the speeds. So here is one of the examples from that 772 research that was completed. The speeds, the approach speeds for this particular roundabout corridor were between 50 and 55 miles an hour for the free flow speeds. So there's clearly an area in there that you can see that becomes the functional area of the roundabout. On the right-hand side, this is from the Access Management Manual again. You can see that if we just look at traditional intersections and how they are spaced, depending your functional areas, if there's room between them, you can allow for full access. And as you move down to the second diagram down, you might turn into just right in or right out. And then finally on the bottom, you wouldn't allow access anymore where the functional areas overlap. Well, generally, with a 55 mile an hour corridor or even 35 to 55 mile an hour corridor, you'll find more of these gaps with the roundabout model than you will with the signalized corridor, meaning that it makes sense that you can probably have more access points along a roundabout corridor than you can a signalized corridor. Just an example of functional area. This is a site here in Wisconsin. This is a location in the southeastern part of Wisconsin that has 55 mile an hour approaches. The access points that are shown on this are very close to the intersection and never would have been allowed if this was a signalized intersection. Yet we were able to install those. Obviously, you got the U-turn on the northbound, but you can also see on the very bottom of the picture, there's a left out from that place. If this was a signalized corridor with the traffic volumes that are there, you would not have had some of those access points. So right in, out, in functional area, those are still possible. Sometimes restrict access to ahead of 95th percentile queue, allow left access on exit depending on volume and stopping site distance, include storage lanes. So there's definitely room for access points sometimes on these high-speed corridors that you can't get with signalized intersections. All right, so back to NCHRP 772. the corridor travel time studies, and it compared to a signalized corridor, approximately half resulted in lower travel time under a roundabout configuration. Better travel times under roundabouts are notable for irregular intersection spacing. So that's pretty important. When you've got a corridor of traffic signals and they're all spaced perfectly at a half a mile or something like that, it's somewhat easy to coordinate that set of signals, and a little easier with access management. However, as is often the case, especially in you know, any real world scenario, those intersections are not evenly spaced, and it's really difficult to do. And this study showed that more often than not, the roundabout corridors perform better when the intersections were not regularly spaced. Travel time runs involving left turns to and from the arterial street had lower travel time with roundabouts. Approximately 3/4 resulted in lower intersection approach delay for the roundabout corridors. This is a study that was done a long time ago, and many of you have probably seen this, but we like to still report on the results from this for those that haven't. But this was a corridor that in Golden, Colorado, one of the first major roundabout corridors in the country. They changed 4 signals to roundabouts. They had a lot of crashes, a lot of delay, operational problems on this corridor. They had a 60% drop in crashes, 94% drop in injuries. The big one that we think is important is the reduction of the 85th percentile speed from 48 miles an hour to 33 miles an hour. When you're analyzing crashes along corridors, generally consistent speeds result in less crashes. So when you have corridors of traffic going from stopped to 50 miles an hour, you tend to have a lot more crashes than you do with a corridor that travels pretty consistently around 30 to 35 miles an hour. So the results of that would indicate that roundabouts are generally going to perform better from a safety perspective, even regardless of what the access requirements are along the corridor. The pedestrian crossing time was reduced. Traffic's only coming from one direction. They only had to cross half. Reduced speeds, so the gaps that they can take are smaller. All of those things resulted in a better functioning corridor. The arterial speed management, the kind of the result of that thing, I mentioned some of this stuff already, but having collision reduction, speed, and travel, I just said, collision rates are lowest at average speeds. Where uniformity of speed is maintained, collision frequency is lowest. Access management, of course, was helped as well. Speed dispersion is directly proportional to crash probability on urban streets, particularly on our urban arterials. So the end result of what we want to say about that is just that roundabout corridors with their average speeds, whether that's slower or faster than traffic signals, you'll get better safety results. This is just a picture of the before and after of that scenario, where you can see the difference in what the corridor looked like. Not only does it operate better, it's just you've got separation between the pedestrians and the roadway. You've got a much cleaner, nicer looking corridor. I'm going to go in and just talk about a couple of examples that we wanted to share. This one was worked on a long time ago, and I did not work on this one. You can see in the picture that the queue on the side street there was quite large, but you can also see a lot of interesting access points along the main line, which is the one going across the picture. The signalized version of this, to improve this, actually added more lanes. There were some other issues, but they had crash problems, all of that. And I'm actually I got a video here of the traffic moving on this, and this is from the south part of the page looking north, you will never see the cues that were once there, and the traffic movement is all fairly smooth. I'll show you a picture on the next slide of what it ended up looking like from above, but you can just tell, you actually can see in the video in the upper right an access point that's not there on the southern one. That business on the lower right part of the picture, the access point actually got moved to a mid-block access rather than being kind of an intersection location. This is the picture of it afterwards, and the movement of that to mid-block and being a right in, right out was actually a benefit to that location for the business themselves, just for movement around their building and the kind of the site circulation. So it was kind of a win-win for the community. Now, most places don't like to create new access points, but in this case, it was just moving one away from the intersection where it was actually beneficial. One kind of misconception about signals, and we hear this a lot at public meetings when we're introducing roundabouts, is, well, I currently get traffic when the signal goes red, I get a break in the traffic and I can get out of my driveway. Well, we've tried to find research or data to suggest that that's not true. What we do have is afterwards, we have a lot of people tell us it's not true. We don't have anything that's real significant, but we can start to see from some of these things that have been done that when the traffic's moving slower and the traffic is not bunched, especially when there's access considerations thrown in, if you just have two traffic signals that are a mile apart and one driveway in the middle, you may keep the platoons together and gaps in there, but as soon as you start introducing a bunch of driveways in there, those platoons don't stay as platoons very long because people start making turns in and out of the access points, which create a lot of friction with all of the vehicles. So the slower speeds that roundabout corridors provide actually seem to work better. We really wish that we had some good data to back that up when we're at public meetings, those kind of things. All we can do is anecdotally say that it's worked in a lot of other places. This slide just is really, you've probably all seen the graph before. On local streets, whether you put in a roundabout or traffic signal probably doesn't make a big difference in the mobility. But as you get to higher speeds, heavier volumes, arterials, those kind of things, you're going to see an increase in the ability to add access points with roundabout corridors just due to the lower speeds. All right, here's another a case study. This one is from Neenah, Wisconsin. This was an interesting site. I got a video of it here. There's actually a fourth roundabout here too that you can't see off the be on the bottom of the page right now. You might see it in a second here as the video comes around here. But this area is very heavy with commercial properties, as you can see, and I'll show you an overhead picture in a minute. But there were a lot of driveway access points here, and as it was analyzed, we did the traffic study quite a few years ago. This was built, I think, in 2011-12 area. But a lot of those access points would not have been able to remain if we would not have done roundabouts. And I will show you some things here. This is kind of an overview of what this site looked like when it was being analyzed. The traffic study for signals, those kind of things at this site needed a lot of, it was like a 5 to 7 lane corridor for most of these streets, which got reduced to 2 to 5 for the most part. throughout this thing. So again, it was the wide nodes, narrow roads concept without really taking any businesses. The orange shown on there was the right-of-way that was needed, which in most cases was parking lot areas, some of those things, but just the increase in accessibility made it better. These are, the yellow circles show a lot of the access points, and some of those, a lot of them would not have been able to remain had this been signalized. This is just a time lapse of what it looked like along the one street. 2008, you had lots of, you know, there were no roundabouts yet at that time. Some of the businesses were actually going out of business. It was kind of a rough spot. It also was during the economic downturn. 2011, we built 2 of the roundabouts. The one to the right is not shown. And then in 2000, I think it was 12 or 13, the other 2 were built. But since that time, there's been $13 million in commercial retail renewal in that area. It's actually thriving now. You can see from the picture, there were some sites here that weren't very accessible prior to this, that due to the roundabouts being installed, there was just a lot of better, the access was so much better that they were able to revive some of those sites. Driveway entrances right into commercial places right off the roundabouts. There's several of those with the roundabouts at the top and bottom end of the page. Both the side roads in both cases are right into retail development. And that's it. I will open it up to questions.
Installing a 2-lane roundabout in an area that was previously only familiar with 1-lane roundabouts, and how the transition typically works. How can you overcome some of the challenges?
Sure. Installing a 2-lane roundabout where people are only conditioned to single-lane roundabouts, right? It's a really tricky thing. Here in Wisconsin, we're lucky because we have a lot of multi-lane roundabouts, so most of the people are fairly conditioned. However, I do work in a lot of places where they're not. I firmly believe that when you first introduce roundabouts to an area, single lanes are the best way to go. And after people get used to driving a single lane, they will better adapt to a 2-lane roundabout. One of the big challenges with 2-lane roundabouts is making sure that they are set up right. The lanes are correct. The lanes are intuitive. People go to the right spot. So doing things like exclusive left turn lanes with you know, spirals in the roundabouts, those kind of things are pretty tricky, and I would try to avoid that in new areas. But if you can set up a fairly standard 2x1 roundabout, that's better than a 2x2 roundabout. I would try to do that first. Getting into the trickier stuff, it's really about public education, and you need to do a major public education campaign. We do a lot of public education now, probably just as much of that as we do design and those types of things. So, yep. Any other questions? Yes.
Hold on.
Is there a volume cutoff of what it can handle before the roundabouts start failing, especially on arterials?
Well, yes and no. I'll say yes to, there's a volume cutoff if you just want to build a single lane or 2-lane roundabout, and those numbers are somewhat, you know, they're debatable depending on where the volumes are, how much you have on each street. There's some general guidance out there about, you know, 25,000 vehicles per day is the upper limit for a single lane roundabout. Maybe 40 to 45 for a multi-lane 2-lane roundabout, but you can get 3- and 4-lane roundabouts. I've seen that we have one in Canada that has 55,000 cars a day right now. That's a 3-lane 5-legged roundabout. So I don't know that there's necessarily an upper limit. It's more about how many lanes and how complex do you actually want to make it. And most jurisdictions don't want to do those kind of things. Even here in Wisconsin, we've got several 3-laners, but we probably are not building too many more of those at this point, just in some select circumstances.
Okay, so with that, let's move to the next presentation. Thank you, Ben.